All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nate Chamberlain, Director of LSPUG. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We have Matthew J. Bailey, Microsoft MVP, sharing careers in Microsoft technologies for 2019. I'm going to give the screen over to him in just a second. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions throughout the presentation, we'll be watching the chat panel on the right side of your screen. So if you want to type those in there, we'll have designated stopping points after each service or app is talked about. So without further ado, here's Matthew Bailey.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew J. Bailey. I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer and a Microsoft MVP, as well as a few other certifications regarding being an architect and engineer. Thanks so much for coming today to my presentation on careers in Microsoft technologies for the year 2019. This is something now that I've been doing for 4 or 5 years, actually. I've been keeping track of all of the Microsoft job numbers and job postings that are out there to understand exactly which careers are growing, which ones are stalling, and which ones are starting to shrink. And I try to give this talk at least once a year to share this extremely valuable knowledge with you, because I base my own life in what I am doing and what I'm going to choose to learn and invest my time in based on this data and statistics as well. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. Most of this is a PowerPoint slideshow. However, there's a little bit of some interactive data visualizations that I will be sharing with you. So first thing I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. Oh, say again?
Sorry, Matthew, can you, we can't see your screen yet. Let's see. Right. Oh, sorry. Actually, I think we can now. Let me just double check here.
Should be on the about me slide.
Yeah, I've got Greg on site and Lawrence. Can you let us know if you can see the About Me slide? Yep. Okay, awesome. This side.
Okay. And I'm assuming you can't see that GoToMeeting panel covering it on the right side that I see, right?
Yeah, they should just see a compact place for chat.
Okay, great. Okay, so back to the About Me, because I know that's really why you all came to attend this webinar, like you care. So, but anyway, like, because I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer and an MVP, my jobs are extremely varied. I'd say that that's one thing that's a little bit different about me working in the world of Microsoft than some of the other people you will run into, is the fact that I have taken jobs as an administrator, as a developer, as a trainer, as a business analyst, as a tester, and as a technical project manager. Throughout doing all of those different things, I have learned an extraordinary amount of information on what makes projects succeed, what people are really thinking, different aspects of what types of questions to ask about technology, and how technology becomes adopted and popular and how technology dies. So I have worked with SharePoint for now almost 12 years, believe it or not. I worked with Teams for 2 years because it's only been out for 2 years. However, prior to that, it was Skype for Business, and I was not working with Skype for Business. I've only joined on the Teams team since it actually changed names. I've worked with Office 365 and Azure for about 6 years, which was close to when it launched, and I also love Power BI a whole lot too. So lastly, if I don't know the answer to one of your questions, I at least promise you that I will try to find out the answer, or I'll point you in the right direction. You can reach my blog at matthewjbailey.com, and I am also the author of 2 books. One I co-authored with one of my best friends, Melissa Hubbard, on Mastering Microsoft Teams on Apress, and the other is the SharePoint Business Analyst Guide. Both of those are available on Amazon.com. Let's see here. Okay, so today's topics: presentation background. So as far as how did this whole presentation come about, and where's the data being extracted from. A brief talk about the change in the job industry surrounding SharePoint and Microsoft. Blab about me, which I already did, but I will ask about you if anybody cares to share anything in the chat box. I'm going to go into some really quick descriptions of the following software within the Microsoft stack. However, I'm going to also assume, unless anyone tells me otherwise in the chat box, that I am not dealing with a completely entry-level audience here. Thus, I'm not going to go into extreme basic details of like SharePoint is a content management system with, blah, blah, blah kind of stuff. I'll kind of breeze past that a little bit faster because I have a great deal of content to cover since I have spanned the majority of Microsoft technologies in this presentation, including even quantum, which is obviously the future of computing. We are going to describe where and how some of these jobs are used. I'm going to give you actual job statistics, job count numbers that I have accumulated and continue to accumulate for my analytical research. And we won't be going into any demonstrations too much except for the Power BI thing. Unless anyone specifically has a request, which they can put in the chat box, because I have access to a lot of the software if that is desired, but I won't take up too much time with demos on that. So I think when I give these talks, I usually kind of ask, where are you at currently? I usually have a mixed audience of some people are at a complete beginning who have no experience within the IT industry, and they are looking to kind of become entry level, or they've just gotten out of college. I have other people that are working in IT, however, they're just not happy in the part of IT that they're in, so they're looking to transfer into another part of it and learn a new skill. Some people are being forced to change just because of what their company has adopted, and they need to learn it so they can keep their job. I don't know if there's anybody else out there who doesn't fall into one of these categories, but if you do and you want to put it in the chat box, feel free to. By the way, silence equals compliance. So, okay, I'm not seeing any responses there. So I'm just going to assume that whoever's online kind of falls into at least one of those three categories. All right, so job trends. Jobs are moving into merged roles. The specialist is starting to fade a bit in favor of the polyglot. What that means is we're seeing less SharePoint only jobs, and we are seeing, or less Office 365 migration only jobs versus now you are being expected to know SharePoint, Teams, Yammer, Power Apps, Flow, and the entire suite. So it's not all that way yet, but it's definitely continually growing in that direction. SharePoint jobs are becoming hybrid or cloud-based, although I would say even at this point, some people are starting to leave hybrid, and the number of people moving to the cloud, I'm trying to remember the last statistical number I had, but I want to say we were over 70% of all SharePoint users were fully in the cloud. The number of open job postings for SharePoint has continued to decline. And I'll go back to, I want to say the peak was around 2012, when I think there were actually over 2,500 SharePoint specific specialist jobs. Meaning like not just, oh, you kind of know SharePoint, but like we want you to be a SharePoint expert. However, there are still some SharePoint specialist expert jobs out there. It's just that now there's a lot more of SharePoint as a part of a job. Office 365's jobs are growing, but a bit slower. Azure's on fire, BI is on fire. Microsoft has definitely completely changed direction in where it's investing all of its money into artificial intelligence and some into quantum and machine learning. And one note I forgot to put on here. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to say that for a surprise, because as I was compiling the statistics myself today, I think I had the biggest surprise of all out of everything of which technology has just exploded, and it was kind of beyond like anything I would have even ever thought. So, all right, so Microsoft's corporate mission statement, the up till last year's annual, so there's 4 earnings periods, and there's always a conference call that Microsoft has, but they always have to file an annual report because they are a public company. And then within that annual report, they actually have to publish a mission statement. Up until 2017, so I believe it was from 2012 to 2017, their mission statement was cloud first, mobile first. Last year, their mission statement changed to this, which is Microsoft is a technology company whose mission is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more, blah, 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 blah. Our strategy is to build best-in-class platforms and productive services for an intelligent cloud edge infused with artificial intelligence. So there's no doubt that all the money in the direction of Microsoft at this point is going into AI. That does not mean there are not other jobs in other areas, because sometimes AI is just becoming a part of those things. I'm sure everyone on the call has started to see how you open up Office 365 and now there's more intelligent behaviors, or they're advertising that Excel is AI enhanced or something. So they're using AI to enhance their own products as well. It's not just a separate thing in itself anymore. All right, so job descriptions. The following are guidelines and job descriptions, but not definitive rules. So these are things that, from my own personal experience of working with SharePoint for over 12 years and the other technologies for so long, that I have seen as accumulation of what is listed in job requirements. My jobs data sampling, these numbers that I'm going to be sharing with you, this is not fluff. This is called Matthew goes out to the popular job sites and scrapes them to get job titles, and then attempts the best he can to remove duplicates, although I admit I can't always successfully do that. And then I create different statistics based on, now I'm creating statistics based on if the title of the job has that name of software in it, which is what I would call a job specific or expert, in that specific software. And then I'm also including job numbers from that are varied, and that software needs to be a piece of your job skill. They're wanting many job skills in addition to that software being one of them. All right, so before we begin our demos and review of our detailed job descriptions, I'm not sure how many people on the call right now are brand new, but I do want to make it really clear it has taken me years to learn this, even with the help of tutors, going to conferences, watching videos, and spending many weekends and nights constantly learning and trying to stay up with this. So this presentation can be overwhelming, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but don't don't feel that way. Just try to take as much as you can from it. And I believe that Nate had said that the recording will be available after we're done, so that you can rewatch it if you need to, as there is an enormous amount of information I'm going to be sharing with you. All right, so first we will start with SharePoint. So why would you want to choose a career in SharePoint? So SharePoint, although it has been around now since 2001, if you consider its undercover project name of Tahoe Server, you know, that's going to put it at the age of being, what is that, from 2001 till now? We're talking 18 years old. So I don't know if you know, but in the world of IT, 18 years old for a piece of software is an extreme rarity, and there are not too many things that are still running that have that long of a lifespan. However, there are still some stable jobs out there, particularly with government, for SharePoint, that just because, in my personal opinion, there's not really anything else to migrate to, even if they wanted to. So some of the things about SharePoint of why you may choose a job in it is just because there's stability and security, and companies have invested a great deal of money in their SharePoint environments. They are, in most cases, larger companies, which means larger companies will pay more and they're going to have better benefits. And in general, because we all need a job, unless we just got lucky and married somebody rich or something to that effect. But unfortunately, I didn't, nor did I win the lottery. All right, so onto the SharePoint job roles and functions. We have different roles within the world of SharePoint. We have the administrator and the engineer, which I'd like to say right off the bat that this job role has been dying pretty hard for the past 5 years because of Office 365 and the extreme limited amount of work that is needed to administer SharePoint at this point. The developer role is still strong. Actually, it's the strongest within the world of SharePoint. There's still business analyst jobs. There's a few project manager, some power user, and the solution architect, I would say, still exists as far as, to a certain extent, the person who has to decide how are we going to build this in SharePoint. The infrastructure architect, meaning how many servers do we need to build this environment, is almost dead because most people have already installed SharePoint and architected it if they're going to have on premises, and if it's in the cloud, there is no architect. Microsoft has already architected this all out for you on their servers. And then there's a few random other things, such as a designer or trainer, although I have to also admit the designer job role, unfortunately, is also on life support just because of the fact that Microsoft has done so much to inhibit branding with Office SharePoint Online or Office 365. So our numbers with SharePoint at the moment. So at the moment, there are 1,345 jobs with SharePoint in the title. So as I refer to that as SharePoint specific jobs. There are 3,161 jobs with SharePoint in the job description, meaning that some part of that job requires SharePoint skills. However, I need to be clear in this case that many of those jobs could be clerical jobs, where they just kind of need you to be able to do SharePoint as a part of like paperwork and typing and answering phones and that kind of stuff. Another point I needed to make sure that I was clear about, these job numbers for every technology only are from the continental United States. So I just want to make sure that you understand that this does not include Canada, Mexico, Europe, or Asia regions at all. Estimating, so these are kind of the job roles by percentage. That did the best that I could to break them up. As I mentioned before, it's extremely clear that the developer hands down is the winner, and then we've got a pie of the engineer and the administrator being the second largest role, and then it's almost even for the other roles as far as the breakdowns of which type of job role takes up what percentage of our total numbers. So the SharePoint power user, kind of a bit vague term, but basically it's just somebody that they usually would like to have control or be able to do enough in SharePoint that you're not quite the programmer, but you're kind of the go-to SharePoint person, and you're probably the site collection administrator for at least one site. You may need, as a SharePoint power user, or sometimes even called the SharePoint business analyst, because that the SharePoint business analyst had become such a manipulated term that that's why I wrote the book on that, because it was sort of like they were expecting you to do many different job roles, and no one else had a name for it, because SharePoint Jack of all trades doesn't sound very professional. So SharePoint Business Analyst seems to be a term that's used a lot for all of these skills, such as understanding your lists and your libraries, managing the term store, and understanding how managed metadata works, working with search, maybe not to the extent where you're creating the search scopes, or you are mapping properties in search to specific columns in the site collection administration, working with InfoPath, although at this point that's kind of moving into Power Apps, working with SharePoint Designer, although at this case that's starting to move into Flow, and that's only if you're online. That is, if you're on premises, then these still apply. Understanding the user profiles of my sites, although that is kind of starting to die too, because it's being replaced, at least the file section is being replaced with OneDrive. If you are still on premises and you have custom designs, you'd be expected to understand page layouts, master pages, and doing perhaps some design and alterations. You definitely would have to understand permissions all the way from the farm level down to the item level, and you're going to be expected to know how to work with all of the web parts. So SharePoint Help Desk and Support, there's not a whole lot of jobs with this left. I will admit the majority of this has gone offshore. You may work in a help desk where you just take questions for all technologies at your company. So you may get some random SharePoint questions just because you're the first level of SharePoint Help Desk support. But in general, anything that's a complex issue will go to a SharePoint engineer. And if it's online, then it just turns into a ticket, basically, and Microsoft deals with it because of the black box effect of where you can't really see into it and do much. The SharePoint Business Analyst, as I mentioned before, this is similar to the power user, except for you're going to add another layer of you're going to be meeting with clients and trying to understand what their business needs are, how SharePoint can improve those business needs for them, and start to collect data, meet with people, be in charge of the testing, working with the architects on how this is going to be built, understanding, creating ROI, cost value savings, things like that. I will say this is a niche in the job industry of SharePoint, and I have not really seen any job growth for the last few years. It's been pretty steady as far as the number of jobs that exist. SharePoint project managers, since SharePoint implementations, there are a lot less of them because almost everyone already has SharePoint. There are not a lot of SharePoint project jobs, and people are building a lot less very large, complex applications on SharePoint where they need a full-time SharePoint project manager. You may be a project manager that's in charge of some projects that have to do with SharePoint, but finding a job that's a full-time SharePoint project manager is hard to do these days. As I mentioned, the SharePoint administrator, the skills I've listed here. Now these skills are going to be mostly for on-premises SharePoint administration or for hybrid. I would say one thing that is different, however, is using PowerShell in Office 365 or SharePoint Online, that is still hands down a very, very needed skill. So that's something, you know, if you're looking to invest time in learning and you're still staying in the world of SharePoint, that I highly suggest doing, because I often have to use PowerShell, and aside from that, once you get good at it, you'll start to be able to use it to do other things with Teams and the other product suites and Azure DevOps and other stuff. So SharePoint Administrator Engineer, these once again, we're just listing kind of all of the different skills that you would need for an on-premises SharePoint Administrator or Engineer. The SharePoint Developer. So the SharePoint Developer is really all over the place at the moment. That's probably why the majority of the jobs available are SharePoint developers, because it's the hardest at the moment to learn. So you have SharePoint, so you have many people that still have different jobs or different, versions of SharePoint. And depending on if they have 2010, 2013, 2016, 2019 on premises, or online, they all could be using a different programming concept, because Microsoft continually is introduced a new way to program in SharePoint every time they came out with a release. Sometimes they came out with multiple ways to program with each release. So that being said, depending on who is going to hire you, you are going to have to know a different type of SharePoint development. That could be provider hosted apps, that could be solution files in C# that are deployed onto the servers for on-premises. That could be using JSON or CSOM for client-side programming online. That could even be using some PowerShell scripts that automate things to do some of the programming or replacement of timer jobs that don't exist online. For sure, with the SharePoint framework, you're going to have to know Angular, React, and TypeScript to be able to get very far with that. The adoption of SharePoint framework is finally starting to happen after it's been out for a couple of years. It was pretty slow at first, which I think is understandably so, because after you've been told that this is the last programming concept we're going to come out with that you have to learn, 7 times, people sort of start to lose their faith in that. So, but if you would like my suggestion on, like, you want to be a SharePoint developer and you have to pick at the moment. So the first thing is, I would say, do you know you already have a job being a SharePoint developer? If so, you need to learn the development that goes with what version that company that's going to hire you or that you're working at is. If you don't have a job, then I would suggest learning the SharePoint framework and the open source technologies that go with it. All right, I'm going to start to speed up because I can see we're already at our halfway point and I haven't gotten as far as I'd hoped. So these would be some of the skills that as a SharePoint developer you would need to know, and these would vary depend on which version of SharePoint that you have. SharePoint architect, I think I'd mentioned that a little bit. It's a person who is responsible for designing the solutions in SharePoint, but as I mentioned before, since a lot less larger projects are being built in SharePoint these days, this job role is not quite as popular or challenging as it once was. Now we're going to get into Office 365. So what is Office 365? I'm sure you know it's a cloud-hosted environment that has Teams, SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive for Business, Flow, Office 365 Groups, Planner, Power BI. Now it's got versions of Project, Dynamics, much, much more. Many Office 365 plans also include the desktop versions of the latest Office applications such as Excel, Word, PowerPoint, etc. Office 365 plans that are online only are a great choice for certain business needs, but are definitely a lot more restrictive when it comes to trying to do workarounds or troubleshoot. And everything is on a subscription basis, not a one-time fee. So we have some basic Office 365 job roles, and then we have the new blended job roles, which I'll get to on a different screen. For the most part, the Office 365 job roles fall into Exchange Online, some Skype for Business, all that has dramatically shrunk. A SharePoint administrator. Sales has also dramatically shrunk, so simply because there just aren't too many people left that haven't purchased it that would consider purchasing it, and the Analyst. So I actually did not update this slide. What I would say in this case, when I'm not talking about the Office 365 merged job that includes, the Teams and the Yammer, and they want you to be this one person that does all of it, except Exchange is usually still very separate. It's rare that you see an Exchange Office 365 job that they also want you to know Teams, Power Apps, SharePoint, and all that other stuff. This pie slice actually is probably 75% Exchange migrations at this point. So it's every time I see something to do with an Office 365 engineer or an Office 365 migration, I look at the details, and it's always, we're moving 200,000 Exchange mailboxes. We need somebody to orchestrate this hybrid Exchange environment. So that's definitely the majority of your Office 365 non-blended role positions. So what about Teams, Power Apps, Flow, and Office Develop jobs? So there are not a lot of these jobs posted specifically yet, but that's starting to change. What I mean by that is, where the job title is actually just that one specific subset of the software, like Microsoft Teams Specialist, Power Apps Specialist, that kind of a thing. However, we have some recent counts just as of today that I've pulled. So the first piece I'm going to share with you is actually the most painful for me to share because, as you saw, I wrote a book on Teams, and I have spent a good part of the last 2 years investing all of my knowledge in learning Teams. However, when it comes to actual job postings for Microsoft Teams, there are extremely few. At the moment, there is actually only one Microsoft Teams specialist job available in the United States, which is pretty disillusioning, needless to say. Now, that does not mean that there are jobs for Microsoft Teams for people who are already at companies who are converting from Skype for Business online to Teams, but that's not a job posting. That is somebody learning a new skill set who already has a job. So there are a couple hundred jobs where I mentioned there's that Office 365 merged role where they expect you to know all of the applications within it. But as far as becoming an expert in Teams, not something I would recommend. And I admit myself, I'm having to change direction because I called it wrong myself. So I still love Teams. I still use it every day. I still think it's great, but I have to be realistic. If there's no jobs doing it, that means there's no paycheck, which means I won't be able to pay my bills, and that's not going to work for anybody. So next, we come to actually the biggest surprise of my research, which was Power Apps. So about a year ago, there were just a few Power Apps specific jobs. And as you can see, it hasn't dramatically changed. I mean, for me to say that there's 10 Power Apps specialist jobs, I still don't consider that to be a huge number. What has changed is the Power Apps being a part of your skill set required for the job. That has grown massively. I would have said maybe it was 80 a year ago. Now I found 559 jobs that had Power Apps listed as one of the skills that they wanted you to know for that job posting. That's a massive growth. Um, just some FYI for you guys that Power Apps is definitely something that's taking off, whether you love it or not. Flow, unfortunately, because the word flow can mean so many different things. My extraction abilities to clean my data, to be able to pull out flow jobs from somebody putting the word to manage the flow of how our office runs, or to make sure everything goes with the flow. In a job posting, and me to be able to segregate that from an actual job for flow, I was not able to do, so I cannot provide statistics for you with that. However, I will say in many of the cases where Power Apps was listed as one of the skill requirements, that in many cases they also had flow right after that. So know that it's still something that is in demand as a secondary skill, if you will, as a part of that job description.
Hey, Matthew.
Yeah.
We have a question from Christine who's watching, wondering why you think there are no Teams jobs when that's the fastest growing app.
So this is and yes, the question's crossed my mind a bazillion times. I have two answers for you. One, I believe the majority of the people that are deploying Teams are people that already have the job, meaning they already work at the company, and they're just taking on that responsibility. So they don't need a new job posting to hire someone for Teams. They're training somebody internally to become the Teams person, and usually it was the person who was responsible for Skype for business. Second, out of every Microsoft technology I've ever seen, the Microsoft Teams product group is pushing out more free information on how to do anything you could imagine, from being a developer, an administrator, an adopter, to roll out Teams from beginning to end completely, totally for free in all types of formats. Thus, they've kind of killed the role or job of I'm a Microsoft Teams expert consultant, because Microsoft is and I've seen this in the rollouts that I've been fortunate enough to be parts of. I'm seeing emails where Microsoft and AvePoint are constantly bombarding these people to come to free seminars with all these links to all this free training. And I mean, to the point where it's kind of like I get scared that this client's going to get rid of me because they just got everything I could do for free. So that's my answer.
Thank you.
All right, next. So why choose a job in Office 365? I would still say it's still stable. The biggest thing you need to know if you're going to do this is that you definitely are going to have to get on board with wanting to learn all of the applications in Office 365, except maybe not. Dynamics is still its own world, and Exchange is still its own world. But your Power Apps, your Flow, your SharePoint, your Forms, maybe a little bit of the Power BI. That you're going to have have some skills across all of it, if that's something that you want to invest in, and this is something that's interesting to you. Kind of skip over this in its sake of time. So Microsoft Azure. Microsoft Azure by far is the largest job group. Although Amazon Web Services is still killing every other cloud provider, Microsoft Azure is number 2. Assuming that everyone understands that Azure, actually at this point, Azure is even more than what I've got listed here. It's become so many different things. It's kind of hard to keep track, but it's definitely a billing based model, software as a service, but it can also be a data warehouse, a data center, a replacement for your Active Directory, somewhere where you can create logic apps, which are just programmed automated functions, things where you can run host virtual machines to host websites, build mobile apps on. I mean, it's just a smorgasbord of different things. So let me get into, I kind of went over here what you can do with Azure, and most important note is much more because it changes weekly, which I think we've all realized that Microsoft products change pretty frequently these days with the constant delivery methodology that they have. Most companies using Azure are larger. So once again, we're going to go back to that. Your salaries will be bigger because there is definitely a shortage of Azure skilled people out in the marketplace. And usually the companies that are hiring Azure specialists are larger. They will offer higher salaries and benefits. So before I get into the Azure job roles and functions, actually maybe let me see what I have here on these slides. I'm going to go to my Power BI report. So this is a few months old, just so you know, because the numbers have actually grown since then. But Power BI, which we're going to get into after Azure, something I'm extremely passionate about just because I am a very mathematical person, but I'm also very much a visual and a graphic related person. And Power BI combines both of these, which I guess you could say forces you to use both your left and your right side of your brain at the same time to create impressive data visualizations. And as you can see here, we have some breakdowns. Although I did not properly clean my data because I have some outliers, as they're referred to, in other countries. If I had properly formatted my data when I created this map, all the jobs should be in North America. But as I zoom in here onto my map, if it's going to work for me here. Here we go. Kind of zoom in. So I want to kind of give you a taste of okay, so where are all these jobs? For the most part, they kind of would be where you expect, big cities. However, there are some exceptions. Why are there some jobs up here in Montana for an Azure architect? I don't know. Is there a government? Perhaps there's some type of a government Air Force or Army base up there that has people that need these jobs. As you can see, the East Coast, because we've got Philadelphia, New York, and Boston all running, and New Jersey running in a row. It's an extremely heavy centralized area. And then we've got some random things throughout the West and Texas and in California. Maybe a little surprised that there's not a heavier concentration in Washington, but I guess now that I think about it, both Amazon and Microsoft are both there. So I suppose since Amazon has the majority of the cloud in general, they probably have the majority of the cloud in Seattle itself as well. So as far as the breakdown of the types of Azure jobs, because Azure is a very broad term, and there's all sorts of different types of jobs within Azure. We have some breakdown here where we've got the Azure administrator. Obviously, you can see that that's a very small slice of the pie at only nearly 4%. Architect is that the largest? That's one thing I like about Power BI. It gives you the percentages here. So 30%. Yep. So the architect is the largest job role. That's going to be somebody who's going to be more responsible for managing your internal servers to merge to create a hybrid environment using Azure AD. Or if you're going to move entirely into the cloud, that you're going to be responsible for architecting the resources, such as the virtual networks and the virtual IPs and the virtual servers, and basically recreating everything that used to be on premises inside of Azure now in a virtualized environment, which can get pretty complex. There are still some sales jobs out there for Azure, and I apologize, all my reminders keep popping up here. There are still a fair amount of sales jobs out there. Cloud growth is not dead yet. It is slowing, admittedly. Many people have at least partially moved to the cloud, but there are still some that haven't yet. So sales is still a part of things. Managing Azure projects, as you can see, is not a lot, but it does exist. And then the engineer role would wrap us out as far as the jobs. Here we have some just some sample job listings that I scraped from different companies, cloud engineer, reliability engineer, DevOps, Azure Cloud developer, engineer, DevOps, support, .NET developer. So you kind of get an idea of what's going on, and hopefully you enjoyed the Power BI visualization to help you understand the data, and it's easier to consume by viewing it this way rather than just looking at another slide. So let's go back to my slides here. Why would you choose a career using Azure? Now Azure also, which I did not include in that map, because now we have Azure Cognitive Services, which includes machine learning and artificial intelligence. However, I myself need to get some clarity on what's happening with this, because I did read an article about a month ago that Microsoft was abandoning its own cognitive services platform due to lack of adoption and moving towards adopting Facebook's instead. I don't know the whole story on that, so I don't know how that's going to affect the jobs and everything else related to it, but it's something I need to research, or if you were interested in, I would suggest you research before you make your decision on going in that direction. Separately, why choose a job in Azure at the moment? Because there's more Azure jobs than any other Microsoft software available. So you're going to be in demand, and I think that you will still continue to be in demand for a good 3 to 5 years before you'll just be considered. There'll still be jobs for Azure, obviously, for many years, but it's just that, everything comes with a peak where it's kind of slow, then takes off. Then it's like there's too many jobs and not enough qualified consultants to fill them, and then they start paying you too much and you're working ragged, and then eventually everybody starts learning it, and then that fades down. So, but that might be why you want to join or start a career in Azure or add it to your repertoire. So my numbers, Azure by the numbers, this is huge. 20,000 jobs have Azure listed somewhere as a skill at part of the job description wants you to know Azure. That clobbers every other technology that is offered by Microsoft. 1,649 of these jobs actually have Azure in the job title, meaning they really expect you to be an Azure expert or specialist of some type. At my last count, just to separate out the AI and the machine learning jobs, of this pool of 20,000, 350 of them were artificial intelligence related and 60 were machine learning related. These numbers might have grown, but one thing I would want to mention that is ironic, as hot as AI is, there weren't as many jobs hiring for it as I had thought that there would be. So that's just a piece of information for you to walk away with. So I already showed you my awesome little interactive dashboard of Azure jobs, and that was done on Power BI, which leads us into Power BI jobs. So just in case you don't know what Power BI is basically a data visualization tool that takes lots and lots of mathematical things and numbers and Excel spreadsheets and makes things that are usually extremely boring and tedious to go through and turns them into really pretty pictures that you can click on. And I can tell you for sure, executives absolutely love it because they just want to see a picture of charts going up, meaning things are good, or things being green because they mean that things are good. So it's a good skill to have. So a good way to impress an executive, I think, would be how I could phrase it. Most Power BI jobs fall into the data science category. So although Power BI is part of the Power Platform, which includes Power Apps and Flow, it is a skill set that is extraordinarily different and requires much SQL, mathematical, and some Excel knowledge that is not going to really apply to any of the other softwares that I have shown to you here, with one exception being that some people are starting to create Azure data warehouses and data lakes, and they are wanting to connect Power BI to that data to then create Power BI visualizations and reports and other things from it. So as I mentioned, the Power BI jobs kind of had formed from people that were using SQL Server information services, SQL Server reporting services. It's definitely starting to replace any type of custom development of charts or web parts that existed in SharePoint. It's a part of dashboard development. People that were super duper Excel users and used Power Query and all these wonderful things in Excel are starting to leave it to use Power BI. And almost all of the Power BI jobs, just so you know, are for Power BI developers, and we are talking mid-level and to expert. It's really hard to find an entry-level Power BI job, just so you know. However, I've got the numbers for you. At the moment, there's 170 jobs that I could find within the continental United States that had Power BI actually in the title. Thus, I would classify them as a Power BI specialist or expert. And there were 2,087 jobs with Power BI listed within the description, meaning that it is a skill that they are expecting you to have in addition to other skills for that job. I already showed you my sample Power BI dashboard. Here's just another screenshot of that. Why would you want to choose a career in using Power BI? First thing I'm going to tell you, you really should love math. The visual part is awesome, and you can even create your own visuals or purchase other visuals. But when starting to understand data trends, being able to explain them to other people and manipulate, clean, and massage the data and then perform mathematical and DAX equations on it is absolutely essential if you're going to be doing this for your job. If you don't like math, I do not suggest getting into Power BI. So that's just the first thing that I want to mention to you. The Power BI visualizations are neat, but most of them are pre-built and there's not a ton of work that you need to do to really to create the visuals. Like, this is not something a graphic designer would necessarily jump into just because there's visualizations. It's definitely ran more on the back end because of the mathematical and the data in the sources that it pulls from. Job availability. So this number on the slide's off, but as you could see, there were still a fair number of Power BI jobs that were out there. Now we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to just jump through our last couple items of augmented reality and HoloLens. So HoloLens still hasn't really taken off as much as everyone had hoped. There are some augmented reality jobs out there. They're usually mixed with other skill sets such as 2D and 3D skills, perhaps in game development or virtual reality, AutoCAD drawings and things such as that. But the numbers on this one, I want to say, I think it was actually up to maybe 60 augmented reality jobs in the USA, but there was nothing actually titled HoloLens jobs. So there's no HoloLens specialist. However, there are maybe up to 60 augmented reality jobs, and many of those were actually working for Microsoft, which means it would probably be in research or as a premier field engineer or sales or something to do with that effect. Last topic we're going to jump into is quantum computing, which is the future, not necessarily in our lifetime, but the future. Just in case.
Hey, Matthew.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question. Christine's wondering if you have any thoughts on the role of a service adoption specialist. She recently completed a course and was curious about Yammer and roles as community managers.
So there are jobs out there for adoption specialists. They're usually I would say, so I've seen a couple Teams adoption specialists. I've definitely seen SharePoint and OneDrive adoption specialists. It's usually that Office 365 end user type of job. I will mention this to you because I ironically have noticed a small increase in adoption specialists. There's a reason that job has been posted. It's because people are not happy with SharePoint, OneDrive, or Teams, and they're expecting you to fix problems that cannot be fixed. So although adoption definitely has a role, and it's important to consider it in the beginning of your planning and your rollout phases so that you can maximize as much out of the product as you can so that it has the highest level of, or the highest chance of succeeding. If you're being hired as an adoption specialist for something that's already been implemented for a long time, it is usually, my experience has been, it's because everything's broken and they want you to fix problems that there aren't necessarily answers to fix because there's already been a chain of people before you that have tried to do it. So if you can get in on an adoption specialist in the beginning, so for example, perhaps somebody's rolling out Teams and you want to be a part of how are we going to make sure Teams is as successful as possible, and we're starting from scratch, and you're going to be part of phase 1, phase 2, and who's going to be in the pilot group, and you know, what examples are we going to use, and how are we going to train on what, and the features, and how are we going to create our training, and all that. That is awesome if you're fortunate enough to find one of those jobs. It's just that there's not a lot of those out there. Did that answer your question? I wonder why I'm not seeing this in chat, by the way.
Yeah, Christine says, yes, she's part of rolling out, just finding it hard to find out what job title should be and how much it pays.
Or say that again, I'm sorry.
Oops, sorry. So Christine, the person who asked the question, is part of rolling it out. She's just finding it hard to find out which job title should be and how much it pays.
So, I mean, usually it's pretty clear. They'll put you know, if you go out to these job sites and you search for adoption, Office 365, SharePoint adoption specialist, something to that effect, they're usually contract jobs because, you know, you're there for a specific amount of time to boost usage of the product, and it will vary. I saw one as low as $50,000 a year, and I have had other ones that have offered me $90 an hour. So it just varies all over the place. You're going to have to kind of just basically see what the market's offering, and then go from there, in my opinion. All right. Hopefully that answered your question. I'm going to quickly wrap up the quantum computing, and then we can get into any final questions anyone might have. And then I'm going to share a link with you to one of my good friend Vlad, whose blog goes over all of the new Microsoft certifications that have come out, which are considered role-based, and I'm happy to report that at least now some of them actually require that you have Teams knowledge or some of the other things within Office 365, because the certifications that have been out there for the past several years have not even included content on Teams, Power Apps, or Flow, and it's sort of silly to have an Office 365 certification that doesn't even test your skills on a large part of Office 365. The bottom line with quantum is quantum computing works so differently that it will be able to solve problems in the future in 1 to 2 days that would have taken an entire lifespan of the universe to solve. That I don't even know if that's billions or trillions of years, that now we're talking these calculations could be completed in 1 to 2 years. Quantum computing is way in the future. There's only a few jobs doing it, I'll be honest with you. There's I found 80 of them, mostly in research. Most of them were not working for Microsoft. Microsoft's quantum approach is different than IBM or other people's. Real quickly, the difference between quantum computing and computing we have today is, as you may or may not know, computers run on electrical circuits with a 0 or a 1. That's why you always see zeros and ones, because it's either there's an electrical current going through it that's a 1, or there isn't and it's 0, and you add up all these different electrical currents going off and on, and that's how you tabulate things are happening and turn them into characters and data and information. The thing with quantum is there isn't an off or on. It's like an ambiguous state where it's actually off and on at the same time. So it's kind of like, instead of just going off or on, it's going upward, sideways, downways, and everything at the same time and still functioning. Extremely complex. I'm sure you even hear the word quantum physics and your brain explodes probably, because it's just not something that is easily understood. However, I mention it because if you are somebody that's really, really passionate about getting into the deep future of technology, quantum might be something you want to look at, because it is, although, as I mentioned, we are in the infancy stages of it, it's going to be a large part of our future. Other Microsoft technologies, blockchain was kind of hitting a hype for a while, and Bitcoin, however, it is dramatically pulled back. There's still some jobs for it, but it is definitely not hot, in my opinion, any longer. And then, of course, data analytics and business intelligence, still extremely hot, and still many, many jobs out there doing that. So I think I kind of went over if any of these careers might be for you. I tried to get into the more specific expectations of what each job would have, and understanding what kind of mindset and skills would be needed, so that you could choose which of these would be right for the way you think and what you would enjoy doing on a daily basis. Creating a career plan, as I mentioned myself, my career plan has been a mixture of anything and everything I possibly could to learn. Eventually, I became a speaker, and through all my work of contributing back after receiving so much, I finally became an MVP. But what I'm trying to say is, you will have to work hard and take any help from any resource that you can get to learn these technologies. If you're in one of those situations where you have no job and no experience, but you can't get the job without the experience, but you can't get the experience without the job, a few quick suggestions I always give people are, consider finding a nonprofit you could volunteer your services to, using this software to build something, thus they could become a reference. Find a internship, find junior level positions, go out, study your bottom off, and get certifications. Having certifications and no skills versus just having no skills, at least people will realize that you were willing to invest the time to learn this, and it was something that you would continue to learn to do, and that you were invested in it. And go to events. There's all sorts of community events, such as this little user group out in Lawrence, Kansas, where you can meet people that share your passion, and they may have leads on jobs or other leads on how you could meet other people who have jobs, or ways to learn these skills. So final thoughts. I didn't become an expert overnight. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, I have thrown an enormous amount of data at you, and just don't quit. That's my motto for life, actually, not just for the career. It's when you quit that it because of frustrations that things stop. I know somebody who's going to remain nameless, who wanted to become an MVP and kept trying, and they quit. And then out of nowhere, they became one. I wanted to tell them they should have never written a blog post on why they quit, but I didn't. So my thought, my feedback to you is don't quit. And that will conclude the presentation for today. If you would like to contact me, my blog and my Twitter and my LinkedIn profile, as well as my email, are on here. If there are any final questions, Nate, did you have any in the chat box you wanted to share, or is there are no other questions?
We'll give them just a minute here. Looks like nothing in the chat. I know questions might be typing in. But yeah, thanks for everything you shared there. That was really interesting. Oh, here's one. Let's see. Okay, Christine says, thanks for the session. It was really helpful to have the overview of the various paths. She's going to go and brush up on her Power App skills.
Well, that's good. And I would highly suggest you do, because just so you know, I'm also doing that. So, yep.
Definitely seems like something we all have to do to just kind of keep up with anything anymore, with all those Power Suite tools.
Yes, the Power Platform is something if you're going to stay in this Office 365 world, at least, the Power Platform, you're going to have to start to make it a part of your life.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have questions for Matthew? Okay, Ashish says, thanks for a great session. Very useful, very informative.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. I appreciate it. I wish you the best of luck. If you have any questions in your career paths or goals, and you need some advice, you know where to drop me a line. Okay?
All right. Thanks, Matthew. We appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thanks.